Impartiality, and about subsequently found its way into the media. Initially, we asked the BBC for the memo and its response to the concerns raised, and we had invited Mr. Prescott to appear. But as the days went on and the BBC seemed unwilling or unable to respond to the growing concern, we decided to hold a broader session that looks not only at the issues raised in the memo, but also the governance of the BBC, not least because of the resignation of the Director General and the Head of News, and then on Friday, the resignation of Shumik Banerjee as a non-executive member of the board. Since we announced the session, you won't be surprised to know that we've received a lot of correspondence from a lot of different people with very different views of the BBC and its reporting, and we won't be publishing these, but we are very grateful to everyone who has taken the time to contact us. We have also requested and received confidential board papers from the EGSC relating to the Panorama broadcast and from the board in response to Mr. Prescott's memo. We won't be publishing these either, but they will inform our questioning, especially to our second panel. Before I begin, can I remind members to declare any interests before they ask their questions? Welcome, Michael. Welcome, Caroline. Michael, we're here today because a memo that you wrote was the catalyst for the resignations of three members of the board, including three members, including the Director General, and the corporation now faces a $1 billion lawsuit from the president of one of our closest allies. I don't need to spell out to you the seriousness of this for everybody in the room or those watching, but suffice to say, it can't be overstated what is a critical time for the BBC and public service broadcasting in general. How did we get here?
Well, I suppose the saga does begin with that memo that I wrote, and at the most fundamental level, I wrote that memo, let me be clear, because I am a strong supporter of the BBC. The BBC employs talented professionals across all of its factual and non-factual programmes, and most people in this country, certainly myself included, might go as far as to say that they love the BBC. What troubled me was that during my 3 years on the BBC's Standards Committee, we kept seeing incipient problems which I thought were not being tackled properly. And indeed, I thought the problems were getting worse. And what was especially troubling about this was that it was all happening just at the time when the BBC faces this fabulous once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, because in the era of fake news, the BBC really can become the go-to provider of news for the entire world. I think that's something that could happen. I would like it to happen, but it can only happen successfully if the BBC, I think, does a better job addressing these incipient and growing problems of the type that the Standards Committee kept identifying. And that's why I tried to alert the BBC board to what was going on, and indeed thereafter sent the memo on to Ofcom and DCMS. There was no ideology at play here, no party politics. If, for example, if you take the example of the US elections report that came before the committee, if it had found that it had been Kamala Harris misrepresented, not Donald Trump, I would have acted in exactly the same way, because I don't want the BBC's coverage skewed this way or that way. I just want it to be impartial, accurate and fair.
So were you surprised that your memo about BBC editorial standards led to the resignation of the head of BBC News and then the Director General?
I was, because I never envisaged events playing out in the way they did. I was hoping that the concerns I had could and would be addressed privately. In the first instance, that was why I wrote to the board. For reasons I can go into if you wish, it became pretty clear to me the board was not taking stuff as seriously as I'd hoped and assumed it would. So I then sent the memo on to Ofcom and DCMS. Now, I'm very clear, and members of this committee, you're experts in this stuff, you'll know this, that the Ofcom and DCMS have very limited powers over the BBC, and quite rightly so, because the BBC is independent. But nevertheless, what I had hoped was that someone senior, be it at DCMS or be it from Ofcom, might have a classic quiet word with the high-ups at the BBC saying, you are taking this with adequate seriousness, are you? And indeed, we now know, since the leak, that I think Michael Grade at Ofcom has said he was planning to, or I hope I'm not misrecalling this, I think he said he was planning to have some kind of discussion with the BBC. So I was hoping this could all be sorted out fairly quietly. As it happens, I think it was 6 days after I sent the memo on to Ofcom DCMS, there it was in the Telegraph. And that then led to this whole sequence of events, including the resignations you mentioned, resignations which I take absolutely no pleasure in.
And in his resignation statement, Tim Davie described the BBC as a critical ingredient of healthy society and that we should champion it, not weaponise it. Who do you think he was aiming that comment at?
Yeah, I saw that, and obviously you'd have to ask Tim Davie himself, but my suspicion is that that last bit of his remark was targeted at big C Conservatives who were piling in after this appeared in the Telegraph. So the whole chain of events was not ideal from my point of view, not least because the fact that it was the big C Conservatives. By the way, I don't want to be rude, okay? Anyone who saw that memo and its contents and took it seriously and had concerns, including big C Conservatives, I'm glad. I don't want people to think I'm getting at one party rather than the other. But it is a matter of fact that because you had these big C Conservatives coming out welcoming it, I think some people came to jump to the conclusion there's some sort of ideological exercise going on here. But from my point of view, there really wasn't. I don't want the BBC leaning this way or that way. I just want it straight and impartial and fair.
In her resignation statement, Deborah Turner said that the recent allegations that the BBC News is institutionally biased are wrong. Do you think the BBC is institutionally biased?
No, I don't, and I'm sure someone's going to correct me pretty quickly if I'm wrong, but I just reread the memo yet again outside the door here. I don't think I used that phrase anywhere in the memo, and I do not think it's institutionally biased. Let's be very clear. Tons of stuff the BBC does is world-class, both factual programming and non-factual programming. I was a political correspondent at the Daily Mirror, Sunday Times, other places for 14 years. I think the standard of BBC Westminster is exemplary. And that's why I keep saying these were incipient problems. We were finding the odd problem here, the odd problem there. And the crucial thing was, when I say odd problem here and there, every single thing we spotted, as per my memo, seemed to me to have systemic causes. And the root of my disagreement and slight concern even today is that the BBC was not, and I hope they will change, but will they, treating these as having systemic causes. There's real work that needs to be done at the BBC.
Do you think that the failings that you highlighted were serious enough to require the resignation of the DG and the head of news?
Not if they had a plan to get on top of things and treat these things as systemic problems. I mean, look, I'm keenly aware. I don't want to come before you sounding like I'm some sort of pompous figure, right? It's not necessarily for me, humble old me, to tell the Director General of the BBC exactly how to do his job. But you've asked me a straight question. I would have hoped they'd get on top of these problems, start sorting them out in a systemic and more methodical way, and everything would have been fine.
What do you think, Carolyn?
Well, my experience was that the BBC took issues of impartiality extremely seriously. We've all heard Tim Davie put impartiality at the centre of his time as Director General. In the 3 years I was involved with the BBC, and prior to that with the Sirota Review, I felt it was a continuous process, an active debate. These are dynamic issues. They're very complicated issues often of impartiality. They're decided in the context of individual programmes on a daily basis across thousands of hours of coverage. So there was a healthy debate. I mean, you've heard from Michael, in the EGSC, it was a healthy debate and often a very robust debate about some of these issues. But in my view, was the BBC willing to have a proper conversation, debate, and actually take action? In my view, yes, they were.
Thank you.
Thanks. Before we get into the a little more about the issues arising in the memo, can we talk a little bit about the role of the Editorial Guidelines and Standards Committee? You're here obviously as external advisors to it. Can you just talk about the purpose of it, how each of you were recruited and appointed to it?
Yeah, do you want to go first, Caroline?
I can go first if you like, Jeff. So I got involved with the BBC first of all via the Nick Sirota Review. I'd spent 20 years in journalism, most of it at the Financial Times, but also at the New Statesman and the Economist magazine. The BBC really matters to me. As an institution, I think it's extremely important, and as Michael said, particularly in the era of AI, when I spent a lot of time on AI, when 52% of the internet is supposed to be generative AI generated. I think it's an extraordinarily important institution to get this right. I worked on the next Rota review for about 6 months. It was a significant review. And then when the opportunity came up to become an editorial advisor to the committee, I was very keen to help enforce what we'd found in the Rota review. There are multiple recommendations in the Rota review, which I can walk through, but at a high level, one did include having broader editorial advisors on the committee. And that's what led to us being appointed. Part of that was led by Ofcom, who wanted to expand the range of editorial opinion available to the BBC. The second thing which came out of the Rota review, which was a key part of our implementation and actually the day-to-day work in the committee, was the introduction of new thematic reviews. These are really significant pieces of work. They took many months of work. They were usually hundreds of interviews behind them, and they were very comprehensive reviews of impartiality and BBC coverage. So we looked at immigration, for example, on the committee. They looked at the role of coverage of the economy. These were very important pieces of work, and I think they are comprehensive and extremely detailed. And they were ongoing. Alongside that, there were independent reviews of programmes, there was monitoring of impartiality, there were new guidelines initiated in terms of training. So if I that's a quick sketch, there are many other, I think we had 39 recommendations from this Rota review in the end that we were involved in implementing on behalf of the committee. So a lot of the work in the first 2 years was very much implementing the Rota review and the outcomes.
It's a fantastic run-through by Caroline. I'm not sure, is there any bit of your question you think is unaddressed that I can actually add value with?
Well, I suppose, am I right to read into what Caroline said then, that you're looking in terms of these thematic reviews, you're not just looking at things that have gone wrong, the committee, you're looking at future challenges, proactive kind of looking ahead?
Yeah, I'll just jump in on that first. So one of the key tasks of the committee is future editorial risks. So, Michael's account gives a personal view of what was of issues on the committee for him. One of the issues I was particularly interested in, and really important obviously, is the role of AI. And is the BBC embracing AI, thinking about it appropriately? And in an era of fake news, it's even more important. So we did have reviews of looking at the role of AI at the BBC. When I left the BBC in the role, one of the issues I spoke to Chris Saul about was how far are we making sure the committee continues to have enough time for really deep dives into future editorial risks. Much longer sessions on some of those issues I think would be really welcome.
So, again, Caroline summarised it fantastically. These thematic reviews, to your point, so they are proactive. They're not waiting for an obvious thing to go wrong, or was that quite right? Which was the case with a lot of things in my memo. But even on the thematic reviews, you see, my disagreement with the BBC is about the thoroughness with which it takes action and follows things through in this area of editorial standards. So if you take one of the thematic reviews, I think it may have been the first one, which was on tax and spend. How does the BBC cover issues to do with the economy, government tax spending, and so on? And there are a number of recommendations from that. One of them being, for example, that it should become routine that if someone is on a News Current Affairs show and says we need more money spent on X, then they should be challenged, well, that's fine, what's the trade-off? Do you want tax to go up, whatever? That was one of many, but a very simple to understand recommendation from that review. And I remember when the conclusions came before the committee, I think it was my first or second meeting, I asked what the follow-up was going to be. For example, because at that stage I didn't know the ins and outs of how every bit of the BBC worked. So I said, after each news show or current affairs show, will there be a tick list? Were people challenged in accordance with these new recommendations? And I was pretty much told, look, don't worry about it. Everyone knows this report. Everyone in the BBC's read it. Everyone takes it very seriously. Now, one way and another, because partly because of my long, years ago as a journalist for 20 years, I know all sorts of people in the BBC, from a junior sub-editor I worked with in the 1980s to very senior people. Not one person I spoke to had read the report. Very few were aware of it. And later on, when we got follow-up reports, they did not give a gold star 10 out of 10 for implementation. So every step of the way, I'm afraid, I feel the BBC fell short on thoroughness when it came through to implementation.
And to what extent is that the fault of the committee? You talked about there are systemic causes and systemic problems. Is that where do they lie?
I think, I'm afraid to say this, ultimately with management, the Standards Committee has got independent advisors, Caroline, myself, it's got non-executive members. I do give credit to the management, by the way, and this may sound a trivial point, I was always impressed with it. These would be meetings that would go on 2-3 hours. The Director General, Head of News, Deputy Director of News always made time, fully attended, paid full attention. But to your question, I don't think it was the committee that was at fault. I think there's simply something... The BBC, I just think, had a bit of a blind spot when it came to following through as methodically as I appreciate I'm only one individual, but as I thought they should.
Is that the fault of individuals, though? You talked about systemic, but it sounds like you're putting the blame on individuals for not following through.
Well, I don't know whether it's a management culture thing or an excess of faith in how things will be implemented down at programme editor level. But to get to the answer to that, that's exactly the kind of thing I'd like them to look into, by the way. I mean, you're almost borderline now talking about these systemic faults that I'm so obsessed about. I think they needed to look at why the implementation was not better.
Thanks, Jeff. Can I just ask Caroline? Michael writes in his memo that he found Jonathan Munro and Deborah Turnus quite defensive when issues were raised. Did you?
I think the BBC is the most scrutinised media organisation in the country. From my experience at the Financial Times, it was a very different level of public scrutiny. It's scrutinised obviously by this committee, by members of the public, by editorial complaints, by its audience. And obviously there are many ways to make a complaint to the BBC. But in my experience, are there times when they're necessarily defensive on some issues in that context? Yes. But as a broad sort of characterisation, I would say I did not find the BBC to be defensive. I found the BBC to be actively engaged in discussions about how to improve issues of partiality on very complicated subjects. And this is a live, dynamic debate when the context changes all the time. It's very hard. It's not one and done. This is obviously a live debate. I think there can be differences of opinion about whether the BBC went far enough on some of the issues that were raised in the committee. And some of the issues that were raised were significant issues. But actually what's important is that the BBC were raising them themselves. They were coming up via the EGSC commissioning research from David Grossman to help facilitate that robust debate and that review of impartiality.
And in terms of the EGSC, I'm keen to sort of get a little bit of a flick. I mean, in effect, you guys had this unique opportunity to be almost a fly on the wall of how this committee is working as independent advisors to it. So you could just give us a flavour, how were decisions reached? Would you say that there was a degree of camaraderie and common purpose when it came to the pursuit of impartiality and journalistic integrity on the EGSC?
I'm happy to answer that first.
Yeah.
I found it to be an active debate in the committee. I mean, you'll hear from Robbie and your next panel. He's robust in how he expresses his opinion and wants the BBC to do well. So I found there were a lot of issues that we covered in the committee. I mean, Michael's given an account of some of the issues, but actually most of the committee was involved in looking at things like editorial complaints, monitoring impartiality across the BBC, looking at reviews of the BBC, thinking ahead about issues that were coming up. There was a broad range of issues that we debated on the committee. So it wasn't always a contested space, but there were areas of the committee when there were significant issues to be discussed. And obviously you've seen some of the research from David Grossman, which is in Michael's report. And of course that led to an important discussion. But I would say each time the executive team would come back and then debate those issues with us. And ultimately, we were both advisors to the committee, and it was obviously for the committee itself, which were the 4 board members, to sort of work out what significant action should be taken next.
What you've just said, it sounds like some of the committee members were more vocal than others, or more dominant in the conversation.
I wouldn't agree. I think it was a very open committee. People could say what they thought. And
the EGSC has been politicised in the way that it came to some of these decisions. In this morning's Guardian, it suggests that all members came from a certain political viewpoint. Is that your experience?
I wouldn't be my characterisation of how the committee worked now.
And I endorse everything Caroline says. Most of it was great. They were very respectful, open discussions. I think I'd have to check this. Most of the decisions that were taken were unanimous. So I mean, I know there's some people saying this is a weird tick list that Prescott's come up with in his memo, but my memo simply quotes extensively internal BBC reports. I think maybe with 1 or 1.5 exceptions. They were all commissioned by the full committee. There was an awful lot of consensus. The one area, I hope I don't end up being a broken record, but the one area where there was not consensus was particularly those reports by David Grossman, fabulous, very professional ex-Newsnight reporter. The reports he was coming through with, so many of them quoted in my memo, there was not unanimity in how to respond to those. Clearly, you can see it in the memo. But other than that, I would totally endorse what Caroline says.
And there was no one member of that committee that was more dominant than the other?
No. I don't think so. Anyway, that's never my impression.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Prescott, you've just said that the BBC is not institutionally biased. What is your bias, if you have one?
Well, it's always a tough job, isn't it, spotting your own biases? I mean, you know, when you read about these centrist dads, I think I'm a centrist dad. That would probably cover it. I mean, actually, you know what? To that question, there are a lot of people. I know you folks haven't gone here so far, but there's been a lot of stuff in some of the papers about Robbie Gibb, and the chair was asking, was one personality more dominant than another? You're asking about my preferences. I am no ideological soulmate of Robbie Gibb, for example. I'm a centrist dad.
I'm a centrist dad too, but a company that you work for received over £100,000 from Larry Ellison, a Republican mega donor. You'll be aware that Donald Trump has removed funding from a lot of public service broadcasters. Is it true that you actually want the BBC to be impartial,
Yes.
based on those affiliations?
It's totally true. Yes, of course it is.
You said there's some real work to be done at the BBC. Along what lines? Do you think any of that work should be done at the boardroom level?
I think it's a job for the executive, overseen by bodies like the board and the Standards Committee. And if I give you an example, it might help explain what I mean. One of my sadnesses was that when this thing did leak into the public domain, that so much focus, I do understand why, but so much of the focus went on to Trump Panorama, okay? But for me, the most heartfelt, the thing I felt most passionately about was the BBC put out one day, over 12 hours on all its bulletins, a story saying that ethnic minority people in this country were being charged more for their insurance purely because of their ethnicity. And when David Grossman looked into this, he found the story to be utterly untrue. I mean, so it was a dreadful thing to have put out, particularly given, it's wrong. It must have been deeply upsetting for many people out there, particularly ethnic minority people who heard that story all day long. Anyway, it was untrue. So you just have to ask yourself, okay, how could the BBC get this so wrong? Who had the idea of doing this story? Who conceived of it? Who did the initial research? Who did the initial reporting? Who wrote the script? Which editors cleared it across the whole of the BBC all day? A completely untrue report. There were multiple levels of editorial failure. Now, we never got a good accounting for that at the Standards Committee, and I would have expected, with a better culture when it came to these things, a complete look at every single failure and ideas for correction. I said many times at the committee meetings that things would come up, many of them in my memo, and I said, to me, this makes me worry about recruitment, about training, about professional standards, about the systems, about the processes. The BBC, I know in the chairman's memo, he tries to say, all this stuff is old, we dealt with it all. Well, to me, what I was frequently seeing was that the BBC's idea of dealing with something was to change the editors around, tweak the written guidelines. But there was never, it seemed to me, any willingness, and take the story I've mentioned, to look into exactly what went wrong there and whether there were deep implications. And of course, since the memo came out, you've had people like Mark Irwin, very respected, a former BBC correspondent. He's done a piece on Substack. I don't know if you've read it. It's worth reading, where he seems to sort of, he's not criticising my memo, far from it, but he says he thinks that there are issues like this in the BBC, and there are deep cultural forces at play here. So there's a lot for them to look at.
You mentioned the memo a few times. You also told us that you'd sent it to Ofcom, DCMS, and you'd had that meeting with the BBC. 2 weeks later, the Telegraph had that memo, and they said that it was circulating around government departments. Do you have any idea how that memo got to those other departments or the Daily Telegraph?
No, absolutely not. All that I know is what I've stated.
Did you share that memo with anybody else beyond the BBC board?
Absolutely
and those
not.
committees?
Well, sorry, Ofcom and DCMS, but beyond that, no.
So somewhere there's a leak. Any idea where that might be?
The case. No, I have no idea.
Thank you, Chair.
Did you work with anyone else when you prepared your memo?
No, it was all my own work.
Natasha.
Thanks very much for coming in today. So, Caroline, you mentioned the Sorority Review and talked about the depth of work that was involved in that. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points. The review did find a culture of defensiveness at the BBC, especially around admitting mistakes, as the Chair sort of mentioned, and that was in 2021. Have things improved?
I think they have improved. I think we can point to things like Tim Davie on Glastonbury. I think that was a speedy apology, and rightly so. I think there are probably many other examples of where the BBC has apologised in the last few years. But I would say I think the real issue is the culture of the BBC in terms of the level of attention paid to these issues. And again, in my view, the fact that we had a robust committee to debate issues of impartiality, the fact that we had David Grossman being commissioned by the GSE to ask questions about the BBC's coverage in order to help inform future coverage was actually really significant. I think there are a few organisations when you actually have that level of auditing internally on a regular basis, and this is an ongoing issue. This is not one and done in terms of managing these issues.
You kind of mentioned Tim Davies' sort of robust and very quick response to Glastonbury. Do you have any ideas as to why the kind of robust and quick response didn't come this time round?
I wasn't involved in the issues with the board, so I'm afraid I wasn't privy to discussions, and I didn't know that Michael had sent the report until I read about it in the newspaper.
Why there was a bit more of a delay over sort of a robust and response to
when my memo had leaked?
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry, I don't. I only know same as you, what I was reading in the newspapers. Sorry.
And then just on the Sorority Review again. So, how has this changed the working practice and culture practically at the BBC? We keep coming back to this thing of culture and transparency. Well, how has it actually changed anything?
I'll give a few examples. So, first of all, there are internal programme reviews which were reported on to the EGSC. So if there were particular issues with the programme, that they all led internally, we were given a high-level view of whether the programme was performing well or not performing well, and some of the outcomes of those reviews. That's frustrating and difficult for programme makers to have an additional level of insight in terms of what's happening, to be asked questions. I think that's important. The thematic reviews are significant pieces of work. I point to the immigration review. I think it was a substantial piece of work by Madeleine Sumption. And in fact, Madeleine continuing to be involved with the BBC for another year, advising the BBC, going around the region, speaking about immigration, better ways to cover it, asking questions. It was a very thorough process of her and her team continuing to act on behalf of the BBC, give recommendations and advice, and being available as a resource on issues of immigration and how well to cover it, which is a challenging issue. So I would say, in terms of specific practical impacts, those are two good examples. I think a third is performance reviews. So again, we understood that impartiality was becoming a big issue in terms of being, frankly, played into how people were being judged in terms of being good editors of programmes. So again, it was an issue in terms of impartiality was embedded into sort of a new performance culture. Could there be improvements? Yes, and I have a few ideas on things which might be continue to be improved, but I do think it had an impact. And they also had a lot of focus on training. Not surprisingly, you have lots of people coming in and out of the BBC. People who were outside the BBC also had to do the editorial training. So I think across a number of areas, I would say there was a systematic change in terms of what we were doing on the committee and what we were seeing.
But how do we then kind of get in the position that we're in now, where, you know, Michael, you felt compelled to write your memo? Is there an issue around transparency at the BBC? Is there an issue with just being transparent and honest about when things go wrong?
I think there kind of is when it comes to self-criticism, actually. I just think that Caroline's described the processes very well, and the BBC does try to look at itself, and it's done a lot of the right things and a lot of responsible things. But I just think that then when it comes to following through on actions, it's not always fantastic, and you do get levels of denial, as per my memo, whether it was the issues in covering the US presidential race or Israel, Gaza or whatever. You got these reports through from David Grossman, and the management's response was to just plain deny. So, well, we don't agree with them. And what was the rationale? Did they outright find David Grossman was wrong on the facts or out-argue his rationale? No, they just disagreed with them and didn't do anything.
Do you think to what extent do you think there's an issue with the comms of the BBC? I mean, it feels like there's some kind of muscle memory of how to mishandle allegations of editorial mishaps and mistakes. Is there a problem with their communication? Because quite often you get a very defensive, very short statement that comes out in the initial period, and then a bit more sort of self-reflection and self-flagellation a bit further down the line. But to what extent is that just my perception?
Well, it's a mighty big organisation, isn't it? And sometimes it is difficult to check out all the facts internally and make the most powerful statement that you can. I think it's more to do with what I suspect are some cultural forces at work in the BBC, and I think even as I sit here before you now, I just don't think the BBC's been very willing to look at things through that prism.
You feel that there's a culture endemic in the BBC?
I think there could be. Now, I certainly do not claim to be an expert on this, and I already commended to the committee this piece by Mark Urban, who spent many, I think, decades probably in the BBC, and there are others. But the things we were seeing and the management reaction to some of the issues that I outline in my memo make me fear that could be a component of what is going wrong. And that's why, at the start of this meeting, I kept referring to incipient problems, right? I don't think this is catastrophic yet, but I do think that it seemed that things were getting worse. That was my honest perspective, and I think it's hopefully reflected there in the memo that you'll have read.
To what extent do you think it's that which undermines people's trust in the BBC?
Well, trust in the BBC is a big subject, isn't it? I mean, it's not even all party political. You've got urban, rural bias, possibly a London focus, London values versus values outside of the capital. I mean, it's a lot there.
You wish to expand?
On trust in the BBC? Well, I suppose simply, and this is kind of what my memo is about. I think the public expect the BBC to be honest, accurate, impartial, fair. It is most of the times. It needs to do a better job when it's caught out not being so.
Would you say Would you say it was defensive? Would you say one of its headlines would be that the BBC is defensive?
Yes, I would. So, for example, another thing. I'm not being boring, continually referring back to this memo, but another thing in my memo was that there's this strange episode where a group of Oxbridge historians calling themselves History Reclaimed said, look, every time there's this, not every time, I think they sample 4 or 5 programmes, but they said it's curious, because it was a carefully written report, they didn't overclaim. They were honest about the limited number of shows they'd watched. And they said, we do seem to notice a tendency that in all these shows, instead of getting the foremost historical expert in the field, they're getting people who are far more inexpert, and our suspicion is it's because they're giving them controversial quotes rather than the best take you could possibly get. And the BBC's, and as per my report, I thought this was interesting and should be looked into, because History Reclaimed also had a very simple fix, which was, could the BBC have another look at who they were inviting in from the field of historians to comment on things? That was it. Would the BBC listen? No. And in fact, there were then formal complaints from readers who'd seen that report, based on the report, and the BBC rejected them all and accused History Reclaimed of cherry picking in a very snotty fashion. Well, History Reclaimed didn't claim to be doing more than that. They said, we've watched 4 or 5 problems. Might be a problem here. Could you take a look at it? The answer was formal findings. You're wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong. We're not talking to you. Extraordinary.
Do you think the BBC is arrogant?
I'm sorry?
Do you think the BBC is arrogant?
Not institutionally, no. I think it's more... Look, when you run a big outfit like that, you'll all appreciate this, you've got to maintain staff morale, and the management have to be seen to be defending their own folks. And believe it or not, even after that memo, I totally get that. But they get it a little bit wrong, and I think that was an instance, and there are other instances in the memo.
Thank you, Cam.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Prescott, do you think that the BBC is in a better place for the 3 resignations? Do you think public trust should be greater or lower for those 3 resignations?
Ooh. It's very hard to answer, because I think the answer to that depends on each individual citizen's perception of what's gone on.
You speak of culture.
Yeah.
Which starts from the top, does it not?
Yeah. Usually, yes. So, and you want to know bluntly whether I think it's better or worse for not having Tim Davie and the rest of them there, I guess. Well, look, let me answer this way. For what, I took no pleasure in those people feeling compelled to leave their jobs, number one. And as regards particularly Tim Davie, for what little use or worth this is to him now, firstly, I always liked the guy. And secondly, most importantly, to the extent that inexpert me can judge, he seemed to me to be doing a first-rate job across 80 or 90% of the portfolio. It was just that he had this blind spot on editorial failings. I think it's a bit of a tragedy he's gone. I thought he was a supreme talent, but he had this blind spot.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Michael, were you pleased that your memo found its way into the...
No. Gosh.
You're surprised?
As I say, yeah, I was surprised. And firstly, I was surprised. Secondly, as I think I said a little while ago, I was hoping this might be sorted out quietly, board, Ofcom, DCMS. So that's one thing. Second thing is, again, I kind of alluded to this, given what, believe it or not, I was hoping this memo would do good and result in a better BBC being quietly achieved. And the fact it was in the Telegraph, no, I'm not criticising the Telegraph. They gave a lot of space, they took it very seriously. But in sort of ideological terms, the Telegraph appeals to a certain bit of the spectrum. And I think, therefore, the fact they broke the story became a bit of a barrier to people elsewhere on the political spectrum taking this as seriously or thinking this really was as straightforward as it seems. So that's my answer.
And in terms of the comment that you just made about Tim Davie having a bit of a blind spot in an editorial sense, to what extent do you think that is simply because of the fact that that DG job is just too big for one person?
I've been thinking for a while that it is, and what's happened to Tim confirms that. So again, look, I'm not here to claim I'm the biggest expert in the world on organisational design, but as you asked me, and I was an advisor to this committee, it seems to me, I think the BBC might be well advised to consider having an editor-in-chief on the one hand and a CEO on the other. Yeah. And I very well remember the period in the 80s when they did try that, and John Burke was at first not, in charge of the whole of the enterprise. They did split the role, and I think it's probably worth looking at that again.
Do you have a view on that, Caroline? On
Tim Davie, sorry.
Splitting the role.
Splitting the role. My role was an editorial advisor to the EGSC. I think the issues of whether the overall structure of the BBC and the governance for Tim versus the role is obviously for this committee and for the BBC board itself. It is a very large role and a very complicated role and very hard to get right consistently. And I think in previous times you've had a deputy director general of the BBC, and I think probably it's such a large role and a lot of issues that I think that might benefit from it.
Is that how you'd rather see it split, a DG and a deputy DG, or would you rather, as Michael suggests, have an editor-in-chief alongside a DG?
I don't really have a perspective on it. I mean, I have a personal view as an average person looking at this, but I don't believe...
What's your personal view?
Well, I think my personal view is what I've just said, is I think it would be helpful to have, it's a large job with a lot of responsibilities, and it's an important institution to get this right.
And were you wanting to come in?
Thanks, Chair. One more, Mr. Prescott. You spoke quite highly of Tim Davie. What was your relationship with, excuse if the mispronunciation that is oncoming, Shamit Banerjee? Did you have a relationship with him?
No, I don't know the individual, no.
Okay.
Thank you, Cam. Let's move on to Vicky, please.
You rightly pointed out that the Panorama programme has been picked up quite a lot in terms of your note. And this was discussed at 2 meetings of the EGSC in January and May.
Yeah.
Why do you think that the EGSC failed to act satisfactorily at either meeting?
Well, at the first meeting, so if I, probably the best way to answer that, and it'll certainly help me give you a good answer, is if I go through the chronology. So I happened to be at home and I watched that Panorama. It struck me as having issues to do with balance. I didn't think it was quite what I might have expected. I still wasn't too bothered because I thought, well, that's quite an anti-Trump programme, but they'll probably be just as hard on Kamala Harris next week, and they weren't. So I mentioned this at the committee. David Grossman was asked to look into it all, and he came back in January with the findings, which are summarised in my memo. The BBC executive did not seem, how shall I put it, they did not seem very open to accepting what David was saying, and so they were asked, and they agreed, as I say, there's usually consensus on the committee, they very happily agreed to go away and come back with a written response, having, to the mind certainly of me and recollection of me, and I suspect others, seemed to be not open to accepting what David was saying, even though his findings were so stark. So they did come back in May with this written response. Again, parts of the written response are quoted in my memo, and it was black and white. The management did not accept there was a problem either overall with the US presidential coverage or with the Panorama programme. Simple as that.
Just on that, can I just... sorry, Vicky. The Grossman report says that generally speaking, the coverage of the election issues was generally excellent.
Yeah, so I hope I've been clear. What I'm focusing on are incipient problems that need addressing. And in my memo, you'll see, because I was trying to summarise it all for the board of the BBC, I think it's 7 points or something, kicking off with they ignored or broke their own guidelines on use of opinion polling. So there was a lot to the Grossman report. And actually, do you know, it's good you've mentioned that, because that kind of gives you the context. That was very much the BBC management's view. It was great. They were excellent. On page 3, David Grossman's report says it was all excellent. Well, there was a lot to praise. And by the way, I've been a reporter. I hope the BBC Washington staff don't think I'm sitting here getting at them. I know they're doing tough jobs, okay? But David Grossman did not give it an absolute gold star. There are a lot of issues, as summarised in my memo. And so, I don't know, hopefully does that cover...
Well, I mean, I think there could be an accusation that you didn't represent the Grossman report fairly in your memo, and that whereas you picked up all the points that he made that were criticisms of the BBC without stating the context, which generally speaking he was positive about the coverage and had put forward these particular problems as issues that needed to be corrected for next time.
Well, look, David Grossman would have to speak for himself. My take was firstly that he was being polite. Secondly, there were a lot of very specific instances in the full report, summarised in the memo, of things that had gone wrong. And you know, that both my memo to the board, its intent, remember, this was conceived as a private memo to 14 people, and it was meant to be a call to action. So it was not, I didn't put in the stuff for celebration. It was very deliberately highlighting problems and faults that I felt were not being addressed properly.
Back to the Panorama documentary. So you said that you watched it on the 6th of January and that was the point.
I think it was the show, I think, was... sorry to interrupt you. It was just before the presidential race. I think it was late October.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
So you watched it, and then that is what prompted you to put in complaints, even though there was no complaints about the Panorama documentary.
Yeah, I wouldn't characterise it as a complaint. That's not really how the Standards Committee worked. So I watched the show, okay, and even after watching it, although I thought, a lot more anti-Trump witnesses than pro-Trump and so on, I thought it was a bit of an anti-Trump programme. Didn't think it was fair balanced, as you might expect typically from the BBC. But even then, I wasn't too alarmed, because I just thought, and by the way, I rather enjoyed the programme. But I thought, they'll probably be doing just as aggressive a look at Kamala Harris next week. That's why this was so aggressive on Trump. And there wasn't a balancing programme. And so I can't remember now, I'd need to check whether I emailed David Grossman or raised it at the next committee meeting, but I simply said, could David have a look at the show to see what, because I could have been wrong, that actually it was in line with the standards and it was all fair enough. And so that's how it wound up being looked at.
Then in terms of your memo, when did you include the Panorama programme into your memo?
Well,
was it at the start or later on?
No, my memo was all written of a piece. So although it begins with the example of Panorama, because I thought it was a very stark example of things, the sorts of things that had gone wrong and were not being addressed. So that's why I nosed off the memo on it. But everything in the memo was written, way after because I left my last meeting of the Stands Committee was June, and it was in some months after, actually, before I started writing the memo.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Prescott, you mentioned that the January 6th documentary wasn't really of the editorial standard you expected, but that you thought that perhaps they'd be just as hard on Kamala Harris. Yeah. It has occurred to you, though, has it not, that Kamala Harris wasn't found by the January 6th committee to have played an active role in the Capitol riots?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. But
so what would such a documentary look like as a companion to the Donald Trump?
Well, the Trump Panorama was looking at his history as obviously he'd been president once already, his track record as a politician, and purported to be trying to look at the secret of his appeal. Mm-hmm. And then thirdly, trying to look at what might the consequences be of him winning. If he'd lost, he might have faced more lawsuits. If he won, he could crush them. It's that sort of thing. So an equivalent look at Kamala Harris might be, well, what is the secret of her? What is her track record? What is the secret of her political appeal? What would the consequences be if she won? So it's pretty straight up and down, really. Or to me, it seems so.
Thank you. Do you agree with Donald Trump's assertion that his reputation has been damaged by this documentary, considering, of course, that he was found to be a central figure in this insurrection, considering that he has been found by a civil court as being liable for sexual assault, that he's regularly boasted about sexual assault? Do you agree with Donald Trump that this documentary has harmed his image in some way?
If I could answer in two parts, as it were. Firstly, I'm supposing, but you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I should probably restrain myself a little bit, given that there is a potentially illegal action. All I can say is I can't think of anything I agree with Donald Trump on.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks both. Very interesting. You've obviously got similar backgrounds in a way, Fleet Street and then the PR industry for a long time after that, but different conclusions as well. So fascinating. Thank you for both coming in. I just wondered, I think Jeff asked this earlier, so you were advising the EGSC. How did you hear about the job?
You want me to go first?
Just, I'm curious to know, probably a lot of our constituents would like to advise the BBC. Where does this get advertised? How did you hear about it?
I don't know. Can I beg your indulgence and give you what may be a longer answer?
A shorter one is probably better because,
okay.
Just really want to know how you got the job, not a long anecdote. Just how did you hear of it?
I come from a working class background, son of immigrants. I got into Oxford from the local state school partly because of the excellence of public service broadcasting. I used to quote the shows in my essays. So I've been passionate about public service broadcasting for decades. I read every spit and cough about the BBC. I followed the Martin Bashir scandal. I saw that Nicholas Sirota did a review. Caroline was part of it. And I saw in the newspapers that one of the recommendations was to create this post. And I thought, what a fantastic job. I'd love to get that. So I looked out for the advert and I applied.
And it was advertised? Yeah, yes. Caroline, you said.
It was publicly advertised. Obviously, I was aware that they might create the role because it was one of the recommendations of the Sirota Review. And obviously, I was very interested in making sure the Sirota Review went somewhere. So I was very interested in making sure that the actions recommended by the Sirota Review were actually implemented. And I wanted to play a part in doing that.
Okay, yeah, no, just curious to know. And also, I guess the Grossman researcher role, he's not here, is he? Well, curious to know where these things are advertised. I've never seen those adverts.
Well, But
How he was
you're probably better directed at
Okay,
the chairman,
the next
because
one,
I can't. I don't know. It wasn't openly advertised, was it? That one?
I think
don't know.
that's
I don't
one.
think so. I think it was an internal appointment,
It wasn't.
in effect, for a researcher. But you need to check with the Beeb.
Okay. I mean, look, just you said to us, Michael, that I think you say in your memo as well that you've never been part of a political party. You're a centrist dad. You have no axe to grind. I think it says somewhere, hang on, you do not hold any hard and fast views on matters such as American politics. But, I mean, if you go through the memo, there are some quite interesting terms. Lawfare is one that's used by the MAGA generation. That's used as fact. And I think you critique the word reproductive rights, which is fairly common currency. You know, we talk about it in this parliament. So, I mean, it does feel, and you've said also that there should have been a programme equally aggressive towards Kamala Harris. I mean, isn't this a weird sort of equivalence? Because Trump had a term as president. He had been found guilty of incitement. And we know that edit was wrong. That was very wrong. They should have indicated, you know, like a ... you would in journalism, that these are two different parts of the speech. But, I mean, I don't know, there are some people making conclusions. If you look at the things in the dossier, what have we got here? We've got Trump defence, we've got trans, we've got Gaza. Are they not all from one sort of perspective, these comments?
Oh, gosh, thank you for the question. There's quite a lot there. On the selection of things that are in my memo and that David Grossman looked at, and you can check this with the BBC, I think there was only one that I suggested be looked at. So that menu that you're referring to and saying it was a curious selection, it was unanimous. Those topics for David to look at were unanimously agreed by the whole committee, so they're not mine. And when you mention, you know, quoting lawfare and reproductive rights, I think I'm right here that that those are words that appeared in David Grossman's reports. There's a lot of misapprehension. I'm not saying this is a view, but out there online, so on, there's a lot of misapprehension out there. In a funny way, a lot of my memo wasn't written by me. It was me quoting David Grossman's internal BBC reports. And he mentions I think it was him who made the point about lawfare, and it wasn't meant to be a party political or ideological point. He was making a very simple point that in America, unlike Britain, if you get a prosecuting counsel, they may be carrying a party political strike, they may be a political appointee, and that was important for audience understanding of the full context of the onslaught on Trump. Reproductive rights was in his American election report, where he was making the point that if correspondents use those terms as common parlance, there's a danger that you alienate part of the viewership who don't use that language. But this was all stuff these were not my views. These were all, you know, me quoting from the internal BBC reports.
Caroline, isn't it the duty of all people on the board and the advisors to the board to represent all licence payers, and that's millions and millions of people? It just looks like these particular hobby horse culture war issues have been selected in one direction. I mean, surely your responsibility is to all licence fee payers.
Do you mind if I
and at the same time, you know, we hear at the same time you two served your term, there was a letter from 400 BBC employees. There are the all-staff meetings. There was one just the week before last. There has been a letter we've been circulated by 100 eminent BBC folk, including Dimblebees and whatnot. So those are very different to the selectively picked examples here that all seem to betray a political bias themselves.
Yeah, I know. I've seen that point of view expressed online and so on.
Matthew Parris, if you look at him, you're giving us articles in The Spectator. His view of the Trump documentary, which I watched last night, 12 seconds within a 70-minute show. It was wrong, it was a bad edit, but I'm sure there's loads in there Trump would have liked. The MAGA superfans showing their adoration for him.
So this idea that there was a sort of ideological or party political skew to the work that was going on, I don't think it's actually entirely fair. And you've got to realise that when those reports were commissioned, we did not know what was going to come back. So if you take, for example, the BBC's coverage of US presidential elections, okay, when the committee asked David to look at this, he could have come back with a completely clean bill of health. it's possible.
He largely did.
Well, okay, hang on. It's possible I suppose, to conceive that he might have come back saying, you know what, we were a bit unfair on Kamala Harris because Trump is so bombastic and says such outrageous things.
There's no equivalence there. Okay.
So you couldn't. I'm just asking you. Obviously, you're very free to disagree, but it could have been Grossman came back and said, you know, we've been a bit unfair to Kamala Harris because Trump's so bombastic that we end up giving her too little airtime. That he might come back. As it happens, he did come back saying there was a skew against Trump's side, but we didn't know that's what his finding would be in advance. So I don't think it's entirely fair to suggest the committee had an ideological hue in commissioning the bits of work.
No, I'm saying the memo, not the committee.
Oh, the memo.
Because, you know, if you're saying you have to sling an equal amount of mud, surely the role of the journalist is to tell the truth.
Yeah, sure.
So do you have to find, do you know what I mean, just because tit for tat thing, because... Or do you tell
I certainly agree with what you say, both about you know, the truth and things being balanced. But the stuff in my memo, I think covers almost all of the David Grossman report. So it's not as if there were 100 reports and I picked these ones and they've got an ideological flavour to them. I've mentioned most of the reports that were done, and they were commissioned by always commissioned by the whole committee.
Sorry, Caroline.
I was going to say that looking at the overall debate we had in the committee, it was a long report, 20 pages, looking at US election coverage as a whole. And the whole point is to look at, are there areas of concern, bias, inaccuracies that might become a systemic issue and that we have to address going forwards. My view of that particular report was, I'm not saying it was a complete clean bill of health. There were issues that I think the BBC had to address, issues about how are we reporting appropriately in terms of individuals who are being quoted. Is the balance of geography of where the BBC was based in America and their operations appropriate and representative of kind of American coverage? And in fact, they realised that they probably needed to do more to change the balance of their geography across the thing. But actually, what I took away from that report is that there was actually very good coverage of the US elections, powerful coverage. Yeah. And not quite perhaps the same, I have a difference of opinion about how important the concerns were around the US election coverage as a whole, and having read the David Grossman report.
And I'm just thinking of this memo, which has had such an effect, within a very short space of time. I think our committee's writing a thing before we've even seen the contents of the report, and within a week, 2 big heads have rolled, another one since. And some of these points you've claimed history reclaimed. I mean, if you look into who these people are, again, they're Robert Toombs, he's a well-known Brexit person. They're all from a particular slant. So I just wonder if you're aware of your own biases in the examples you've chosen. For example, you say that you should not state that the Trump election was stolen, that was baseless. Do you think that the idea that the Trump election was stolen was baseless?
No, I absolutely do not. I don't remember that bit of the memo.
Also, page 3, it says something like it was a Democrat majority committee.
Oh,
that he was found guilty of incitement.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, our committee is a majority Labour committee. We have a Conservative chair. Are you saying we're illegitimate?
No, of course, oh God, absolutely not. I'm a great respecter of Parliament and the traditions of Parliament. I spent 15 years as a correspondent here. Sorry, that bit that you're quoting, I've now got it. That was when the executive defended Panorama and was trying to argue there was no problem with the video splicing. One member of management prayed in aid the prosecution of Trump and the committee finding that you referred to. That's the only reference in there. But I do come back to this thing though. I'll deal with history reclaimed, because I suppose that was something I raised. It never led to a Grossman report, by the way. That was just one of my bugbears. It's in my. But all the rest of the stuff, as I keep saying, this was not my tick list. These were reports commissioned by the entire committee for David Grossman to look into. We never knew what he would come back with. And if you take American presidential race, for example, he did come back saying, well, actually, was a little bit unbalanced. But we didn't know in advance he would say that. History reclaimed, I can tell you hand on heart, I never even Googled the historians behind it. I just got that they were Oxford.
Then, because they're not completely neutral people either, are they?
Yeah, but you've got to remember, all I was saying on the history reclaimed thing, which still seems to me a small thing, they seemed to me, from what I read in the papers, very reasonable. They'd spotted something little that was wrong. They were suggesting what sounded like a sensible fix, and the BBC wouldn't even consider it.
I'll move on, Rupert. You happy? Amen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Back on the splicing. In his sacred job memo to us, Dr. Shah mentions that since your memo, Mr. Prescott, the corporation's had 500 complaints, and that has, I quote, prompted further reflection. And as a result of that further reflection, the BBC now accepts that the splice gave the impression of a direct call for violent action. I remember the first time I saw the splice, and I looked at it and I was like, oh my God, that's awful. And then I checked a transcript of the speech itself, and that confirmed it. Were you surprised that it took the BBC multiple iterations and multiple months to work out something as straightforward as that splice was that misleading?
Yes, in a word. I mean, this was, in the memo I talk about my great frustration and how I'm writing to the board because of this frustration, and that was a very easy to understand example, that we had a BBC management that would defend and stand by that video edit, which is exactly what was going on, and that's why I was one of the reasons I was in despair, but it's possibly the purest example.
Do you think the corporation has what you might call a bigger truth problem? That there's a bigger truth that the vast majority of BBC output is good, therefore it's less important when something is misleading? Or indeed on the specific episode of Panorama, there was a bigger truth that the programme was trying to get across about that day and Capitol Hill and the character of President Trump, and therefore it didn't matter so much that this thing was spliced in a way that specific impression was clearly so misleading.
Well, I think the truth is we still don't know what went on within the Panorama production team, whether it was some weird kind of accident or someone working under pressure. We just don't know. But as regards the wider BBC, I mean, I've had people I know and don't know texting me, emailing me and so on, who are clearly appalled by that. So I don't think it's a bigger problem. It was just this curious management blind spot.
But obviously it wasn't just a management blind spot. I mean, lots of people must have had a blind spot. I mean, starting with the person who did it, then whoever was editing it, a producer, presumably somebody straight away. I mean, obviously it didn't get the most massive audience because people in general didn't spot it, but many people must have seen it. Then your committee saw it. Then it went up to the board. A lot of people apparently had a blind spot.
This is one of the most curious things about the whole saga, actually. So I watched the programme, as I said. I certainly didn't spot that the video had been spliced. I had no idea. And I doubt.
It was a very good splice job.
It's interesting. Right. It's interesting if you did, but I suspect,
no, I didn't. It was an extremely good splice job.
Okay,
so where you couldn't see the scene. That's the point.
And you didn't realise it had happened. And when I asked for the Panorama to be looked into, it was for reasons other than the video splicing. I thought there were other issues with it. But when the report came back, it just because David Grossman, ex-Newsnight, very respected, proper, fabulous BBC correspondent, he'd also done time covering the US presidential election. So it was one of those weird coincidences that the person who was asked by the Standards Committee to go and do a deep dive into the Panorama, was steeped in this material because he'd been out there covering it. And it was he who spotted the video splice. It's quite possible if it had been someone else asked to do a deep dive into Panorama, they might have come back still not spotting that. It was a curious turn of events.
That was when? That was in time for the January meeting.
Yes, that's right.
An awful lot of time has passed between January and November. So there still were a lot of people who had a blind spot. So after this thing had been identified, I don't mean a literal blind spot, they didn't spot the splice. I don't think anybody spotted the splice. But having been brought to people's attention, a lot of people apparently overlooked it. Until, as Dr. Shah says, having had 500 complaints after your memo, there's been a period of reflection.
As I say, so I keep using this term blind spot. You can use the terminology you want. They had a lack of sensitivity. They just had a different view about the video splice.
And I wonder if I might just finally ask both of you, if you would agree that actually it's people who would like to see the demise of the BBC. They are the ones.
Me, by the way.
No.
I want it to be strong.
Just let me finish my sentence, if you will.
Sorry, beg your
pardon. It is people who would wish to see the demise of the BBC. They are the ones who ought to downplay this incident. And people who love the BBC and think the BBC has a more important role than ever in the information meltdown and mosh pit and misinformation, disinformation, they are the ones who will say that when an incident like this comes along, it must be taken with the absolute utmost seriousness.
Yeah, that sounds a very sensible point to me. I mean, people who love and support the BBC, we want the BBC to be at its best, and that's what this whole thing's been about.
Obviously, issues of trust are foundational to the BBC. It is very important that they take inaccuracies extremely seriously. I would say, I mean, to echo Samir Shah, it was regrettable that this wasn't recognised at the time, and it was too late to, even though Panorama was alerted to this, I think it was too late by the BBC to actually take action on it. But I would point you to the fact in the committee at the time, it was a 20-page report, and the debate was really about a much broader, comprehensive view about US election coverage. It wasn't to try and micromanage a particular programme edit. And individual individual issues were typically dealt with by the editorial complaints unit if there was an inaccuracy.
I'm asking her about a principle, so I was asking about the splice, that is correct, but you could apply the same question to a number of other things in the memo. My question was really, isn't it the case that for all the 99-point-something% of output, which is very high quality and unquestionable, isn't it the case that if you really, really care about the future of the BBC, you really, really have to care about the 0-point-something% that goes wrong, take it absolutely as seriously as it warrants?
I agree with you. I think it is important, but I personally think that the BBC did take issues of impartiality and accuracy incredibly seriously. It's the reason that they're one of the most trusted news brands in the world.
Misinformation meltdown mosh pit. Cam.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Prescott, I happen to agree that it's a catalogue of interesting circumstances that this documentary aired through such a large editorial process. So the question that I want to know the answer to is, prior to it airing, did this documentary deviate from the standard editorial or auditing processes in any way?
The short answer to that is I don't know, and that's exactly the kind of thing I was hoping that the BBC would look into.
Who would know?
Who would? Well, I guess your best witness will be the next one. The BBC chairman may know about that. I only know what I saw on the screen and then what David Grossman reported upon.
Thank you. I just realised you didn't quite answer my last question. Do you agree that Donald Trump's reputation has been tarnished by this documentary?
Probably not.
You don't agree with him? Thank you. Caroline, I've largely not spoken with you yet. Apologies. Have you seen David Grossman's report? Have you read it?
Yes.
Have you read Michael's memo?
Yes.
Would you agree that Michael's memo was an accurate reflection or response to that Grossman report?
I would say that Michael's memo does not provide a comprehensive view of what was in the David Grossman report.
What do you think was missing?
I think the David Grossman report covered a lot of ground, significant areas like the coverage of the election and the use of polling, issues like who was being represented on programmes, issues of impartiality. There was obviously a BBC response to it as well, which was also significant. They did engage with each of the details of the David Grossman report. I don't think Michael's account is a personal account rather than a comprehensive review of everything that was covered in the committee.
You describe it as biased?
I would not choose to characterise it that way. I think it's a personal account of what Michael wanted to bring before the board.
Thank you.
It was meant as I think Caroline's remarks may well be fair, because I'm very open about this. I think I even say it in the memo. It was meant to be, an edited take on things. It was a primer for the board, hoping to get some action, and they could then go away, as I think I urged them to do in the memo, to go and look at the full Grossman report. So I don't think I'd ever claim it was fully comprehensive. It was edited highlights intended to get action.
Is there anything else you'd like to add to that question, Caroline?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jeff, did you want to come in on this one?
Just on that, Caroline, sorry again. You said that it doesn't provide a comprehensive review of the Grossman report. Do you think it gives an accurate sense of the Grossman report?
As I say, I repeat what I've just said. I think Michael's view was not designed to be a comprehensive view of everything in the David Grossman report. I think when you read the David Grossman report in full, it's a broader reflection of the debate that the committee had about issues and anticipating issues in terms of both existing coverage, was there something we should be looking at more closely, and are there actions that the BBC should be taking. My interpretation, my personal interpretation, was that the BBC engaged with this, the executive team responded, actions were taken. It was going to be an ongoing issue. This is a live, Donald Trump defines the news waves at the moment. It was an important issue to actually think ahead about how do we cover Donald Trump appropriately. So my takeaways were very much focused on that broader representative view. David Grossman's reports were not supposed to be comprehensive. They were quick takes, ad hoc research to help fuel a conversation in the committee, rather than the thematic reviews, which are much bigger picture, longer term, lots of interviews, comprehensive research, and looking at a much broader range of programmes.
Just to be clear, so the Grossman reports were the only ones that were asked for by the committee on this particular topic? There were no others?
No, on this case, no.
And Michael, just quickly, Dr. Shah said that your memos are, and I'm quoting, a partial description of the evidence that the EGSC received. Is it fair to describe your memo as partial?
My memo is partial. I don't really think so. As I say, it was edited highlights intended to get action. So whether you want to call it partial or not, it was certainly impartial. Well, there was nothing in that would mislead the audience in it. I think it was a reasonable edit of all the areas concerned that arose out of the Grossman reports. In that sense, you could, I suppose it'd be fair on the American one, for example, say it's unbalanced, because I didn't mention where David Grossman praised the coverage. I only mentioned where there were problems. But I don't mean to sound arrogant. I don't really apologise for that. I mean, it was 19 pages as it was, for one thing. And if you do read the full Grossman report, I don't know whether you're getting hold of it or not, into the American election coverage, see what you make of it. But my plea, you see, is fine, wherever the BBC earns a gold star, that's great. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't take the problem seriously. So I think the first thing there was they broke their own guidelines on how to use opinion polls. Well, what was done about that afterwards? How did that problem occur? And what's being done about that to prevent an accidental reoccurrence? Answer, we do not know.
I think that, would you agree though that they have acknowledged that was an issue? I'm just looking at a quote saying that was the one significant exception to our usually excellent record of reporting polling. So that particular problem with that particular poll was acknowledged. Yeah,
but this goes to my one remaining worry. But I should have said, by the way, I really welcome the BBC chairman's letter to you where he says he's going to go through everything in my memo point by point, which is in a way all I wanted. The one worry I still have is, will the BBC do that, treating every issue there as if it is a systemic problem until they can prove that it's not? So the issue there about the opinion polling, they say they've responded to it and acknowledged it. Okay, but were there systems that went wrong? If it was one single human error on one night, fine. But if not, there's a bigger problem. What's gone wrong here? They need to get under the bonnet and start fiddling around with the spanner of it.
How do they demonstrate that they fix those systemic problems?
Well, for starters, whoever takes the place of Caroline and myself on the Standards Committee, hopefully they can persuade them that they've been doing a more thorough job. And if there was to be wider scrutiny, I mean, it's for BBC as an institution to figure that out. And of course, you as the Select Committee have an oversight role.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, Chair. Michael, you mentioned sort of primer for the board. A comment you just made earlier in terms of sort of like your communication, and you started off earlier when you said that you was a strong supporter in your formative years, how important the BBC was, and I think that many people in this room, myself included, sort of BBC is sort of very important in terms of our sort of education as well.
Yeah.
So, did you foresee the damage your memo would cause?
Absolutely not, because it was. Remember,
Sorry, but
beg your pardon.
No. I paused. That's why you came in. My apologies. But what I would say to you is, did you not see an opportunity, or did you not see a scenario where that memo would be wider circulated?
No, it went. As I say, it went to 14 members of the BBC board, and then senior people at Ofcom, DCMS, who. As I said, BBC's independent, but they have some role in terms of dialogue with the BBC. So, no. And also, I look back, what was I to do? I could have done nothing, but you can hopefully tell from the memo the level of my concern, and I wanted someone somewhere to start doing something.
No, I understand that, but it's obviously been, in some cases you could argue it's possibly being weaponised, and you spoke about people on the political spectrums sort of grasping that and trying to sort of damage the BBC, so to speak. So I'm just surprised you're surprised we've got to this point.
Well, on the weaponised thing, this is a personal view, but whether people at the BBC think this stuff's been weaponised or not, surely that's a secondary issue. There are very specific things that have been going wrong, detailed in the Grossman reports, detailed in my memo. Now the BBC, they say they're going to look at them one by one. Hopefully they'll treat them as systemic problems, in which case the BBC will end up stronger, and I want it stronger so it can conquer the globe. So this, where you're coming from, which is surely you realise there was a risk of damage. Even as I sit here now, my hope and my genuine belief is the BBC is going to end up stronger because of all this stuff. And it'd be great. They can reach billions on this planet with their news and current affairs, given that we're in the era of fake news, if they get this stuff right.
Caroline, what's your view about what I asked Michael in terms of how this has impacted the organisation?
It's obviously been an extremely challenging time for the BBC. It's on the spotlight on issues of impartiality, which in my view the BBC was actively engaging with on a regular basis. As I point out, the fact that the committee was extremely robust, discussions were had, research was commissioned on a regular basis, and it was challenging research. I think that's a really healthy organisation and a very healthy debate.
Thank you. There was a term about sort of systemic and processes, about possibly the BBC not listening, the editorial team not listening, and you gave some examples. And one of the examples was about the insurance, about that sort of misrepresentation and that ethnic minority sort of penalty.
Yeah.
With regards to that sort of insurance story, the BBC sort of acknowledged it was wrong and published a correction in 2024-25 in their annual report, and it's that an example of the EGSC working as intended.
Well, there's a complaints process, as you know, that occurs quite separately from the Standards Committee. Any member of the public can complain, and it's dealt with by certain machinery. The Standards Committee keeps an eye on that and see what they think of it. But this particular story you mentioned to, and the BBC apology, again, sorry for being a broken record, but again, this comes back to whether a problem is systemic or not. How did they get that so wrong? There were multiple levels of failure there, and I know of nowhere, it certainly didn't come before the Standards Committee, that the BBC treated it as such and looked into every stage of failure and what they could learn from what went wrong.
Okay. So given the resolution of the insurance story, why did you not sort of mention that or reiterate it in your memo?
What, the insurance story?
Yeah.
It is in my memo, yeah.
What the BBC, the reiterate, so why did you not sort of mention that the BBC had dealt with it?
Because the point I was trying to make to the board is the same one I'm trying to make to you, and I think I run through the possible levels of editorial failure, who commissioned it, what did the programme editors make of this before it went out, where was the professional scepticism over this claim. So I was trying to make the point to the board, I think the BBC should look at that, among many others, as if it's a systemic problem, and I wanted them to support me in that notion.
Caroline, can you give me an example where the EGSE sort of considered the subject, that concerned you and reached a consensus that you were satisfied with?
Sorry, just to clarify that I wasn't satisfied
That
with.
you were satisfied with?
I think on the insurance, I'm just picking up that one straight away. Action was taken. There was a debate at the board. It was embarrassing for the team in terms of their understanding of data journalism. There were further actions taken about actually doing more training within the BBC about how to understand probability and really proper economics understanding across some of the team. There were new people put in terms of the data science team. So I think, in my view, that counts as action and significant action from the EGSC. If it hadn't come up in the EGSC, it probably would have come up via the editorial complaints unit if there had been concerns, which obviously is another part. It's another part of our monitoring. It's not just this committee, but the editorial complaints unit also has a significant role in looking in issues of inaccuracy. I think another example I can bring up is we looked at the role of BBC Verify and the sort of issues of misinformation at the BBC, and are there issues in terms of complaints coming in that actually show that we should be concerned about whether reporters were falling for fake news. In my view, I think we should be spending a lot of time on those issues. And going forward, if I had one piece of advice for Chris Hall, it's actually that you have longer, deeper dives into some of these, really big existential issues for the BBC's journalism. And it really matters to get that right. So we can, in particularly in an era when trust is incredibly important, and when the internet is becoming a source of massive scale misinformation. So in my view, I think the BBC engaged that on the last 3 years. We did have conversations about that. I like to see the BBC having even more focus on that going forwards, and a wider frame of views and more deeper dives on issues like that.
Okay, thank you. Michael, last question. Any other examples where you feel that...
The committee operated by consensus? In a funny way, in my mind, it probably operated by consensus on almost everything, the exception being, and of course it's the glaring, that's why we're all here, the exception being management's response to some of the David Grossman's more critical findings, where there wasn't a consensus. The management went one way, there were some members of the committee who remained unhappy with it, and you can clearly see I remained unhappy with it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bio.
Sorry, just very, very quickly. So given that there was an investigation into the insurance piece, given that an action was taken, given that the BBC acknowledged there was an issue, I'm wondering how much is that systemic or just a cock-up, rather like conspiracy versus cock-up? Is it just a mistake was made, the BBC investigated, it was corrected, and then if it had, because action was taken, why did you feel the need to put it into your memo?
Oh, because, right, so to me, sort of journalistic error might be I misspell someone's name or I get the date wrong, an error. And of course, by the way, errors occur. I really don't want to come across someone who thinks otherwise or is intolerant of the occasional human failure. But this report was way more than that, okay? So the BBC launched this service called Verify, clues in the name. It's supposed to be even better than your ordinary BBC. It'll check everything out, hard data. And to launch Verify, one of the things that happened was that this report was emblazoned across the BBC Breakfast, Lunchtime News, 6 o'clock news, all the bulletins. This was a big deal at the BBC. We've got a shocking new exclusive for the world. And what went wrong cannot have been surely one person's error. How did they have this notion to study this idea that insurance companies would be charging ethnic minority people more? Who compiled the report? Who checked it? Who edited it? Which output editor said it was okay? Of all the people across the BBC who heard that report, was there no professional scepticism? Geez, we better have another look at that. This was multiple levels of failure. And that's why I put it in the memo.
Caroline's just outlined that better training has been put in place for data analysis, because look, anyone can look at a spreadsheet and come up with an answer for anything. So she's outlined the actions that were taken off the back of that, a clear failure. Where that has happened, is that not the BBC behaving in the way it should behave?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, because this is you zeroed right in on an area of potential continuing disagreement between me and the BBC. So you see, you probably get more of this from the chairman. So yeah, on that one they organised some retraining. They had a look into their use of statistics. To me, now, feel free to disagree with me. To me, just not enough. This was a horrendous and embarrassing error, one, by the way, that could have damaged community relations in this country. I mean, if you're a black teenager sitting at home all day listening to that stuff, how would it make you feel? And it was all untrue. So I think they should have had what you might call a full-on inquest. And I'm not clear they ever did.
Okay. Can I just quickly talk to you about BBC Arabic? It comes in for some quite heavy criticism in your memo. We know the BBC Arabic, on average, are having to apologise for around about 2 articles a week at the moment. But in answer to our letter, the BBC, the chairman, said that they are determined to attempt to tackle the underlying problems identified by both the EGSE and Mr. Prescott. Are those steps sufficient, Michael?
Well, it might be. It depends what he means by that, but I take him to be in good faith, and I'm delighted by that promise. I alluded in the memo to how, vis-à-vis BBC Arabic, I think I put a phrase in, there have been some changes of personnel, a measure in which the Director General seems to place great faith. Because, yet again, you see, my view is just switching out an editor or two is not enough. When you've got such shocking catalogue of seeming errors, there must be more going wrong than just the editor on that day wasn't quite up to the job.
Yeah, thanks. So we've established that the two of you, it was advertised. The David Grossman role was internal.
Well, I think you need to check. I think it was, but I'm really not sure about the Grossman one. Probably best to ask the
It just seems, the memo was very reliant on that one individual. I think you said to Jeff you didn't entertain any other evidence. I mean, surely, isn't it sort of incumbent on you to take evidence from a range of different sources? So throughout your time, there was also the Gaza Doctors Under Attack documentary that a lot of staff were exercised about at the all-staff meeting. There were various other things that happened. The NUJ and BEC2 have written to us. There's 21,000 members of BBC staff. Right. Hundreds of them attend the all-staff meetings. Why was none of their evidence in your memo? Why is it just all slanted to one individual and one political point?
Well, I suppose you can't boil the ocean, for one thing. And my memo was what it was presented as being, which was a summary of internal reports that had come before the Standards Committee and not been acted upon fully enough.
So, okay. I mean, I just wondered also what your relationship is with these gentlemen, with Robbie Gibb. The FT says that you're a friend of his. I don't know, maybe you can clear that up for us. And with David Grossman.
So David Grossman, I only know through him being appointed this role and the Standards Committee. Robbie Gibb, I've known for a number of years. I first met him, I think, when I was working briefly for the political staff of the Daily Mirror, and he worked for BBC Westminster. So, yes, I do know Robbie Gibb, but you've got to appreciate 14, 15 years working as a political correspondent here. I think it's probably not an exaggeration to say I got to know hundreds of people on a cross-party basis. Even today, I've got dozens and dozens of friends from that period of my life, and I've got as many Labour Party friends, Lib Dem friends, as Conservative friends. But yes, I do know Robbie.
And would you call him a friend? Because there's all these rumours swirling around.
Yes, I think that's a fair description, yeah.
Okay, and would you be prepared to publish communications between the two of you in the sort of lead up to the appointment and since the memo?
To the EGSE?
To the committee, to us.
Sorry,
would you be prepared
to publish what?
Communications that you had in the run-up to getting the job, maybe to squash some rumours that are out there. And since the memo was published, which mysteriously found its way into the Telegraph, nobody quite knows how.
Well, on the first of your things, the editor getting the job on the Standards Committee, that was openly advertised, and it was an open competitive process, so I'm not sure quite what it is.
Yeah, no, the question was, would you publish communications that you had, emails?
Well, that's quite a precedent you're asking me to set. What I'm happy to do is say to you that I've had, for example, I haven't seen, my last meeting of the Standards Committee was in June. I haven't seen him since then. I think I've had one conversation with him since then. That's it.
Okay, that's good to know.
Mr. Prescott, can you understand why somebody might find it suspicious that somebody who is described as a friend might have a role in that individual's appointment?
Yeah, look, I think that's a fair enough question, but
If that's a fair enough question, then will you submit the documentation that my...
Well, like I said, it's quite a precedent to set, but let me answer your question directly. So I applied for the Standards Committee position as described. There was then, you had to put in written submission, written thing, and then there was an interview. The interview panel was 4 people, one of whom was from HR. Now, you feel free to criticise me. I just took the point of view, well, if BBC, BBC does do that sort of thing well, if BBC HR are involved, I thought it was fine.
I'm not criticising you. I'm just suggesting that it's interesting that somebody you've described as a friend had a role in your appointment. You don't think that's unusual?
Well, I suppose the thing is, if you operate in this country, in the sphere of politics, the media and so on, it's not that unusual to come across people you know. I mean, it happens all the time. So unusual, well, I don't know.
Can I ask, Michael, if even a memo warning about issues of impartiality has issues with selective quoting and perceptions of bias, is there any hope that anyone can ever be an effective and trusted arbiter of impartiality?
Well, the BBC gets as close as any organisation in the world ever has, and I think it is achievable so long as you're open, transparent, honest, and here, this is in a sense what this session's about, isn't it? And you're willing to take it on the chin when you get it wrong and look into what's gone wrong thoroughly and put in a full programme of reform if needed. So I think it's achievable enough. And by the way, the BBC is the best positioned organisation in the world to do that, even with everything we're discussing. It might be.
That brings us to an end. Can I thank you so much for appearing in front of us this afternoon and for all your time. Is there anything that either of you would like to conclude with before we end today? Caroline?
I don't think so, but thank you so much. I'd just say a big thank you, because obviously this has been all over the news for whatever it is, 3 weeks now. I've deliberately avoided the media for numerous reasons, but not least because I have great respect for Parliament, and also a session like this, you can go through things so much more thoroughly than one media interview, so I'm really appreciative.
We're very grateful for both of you for coming in to see us this afternoon and for answering all our very many questions. We're now going to briefly suspend the meeting to allow the next panel to come in. Thank you very much. Order, order.